Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. Coming to you live from the frozen north, apparently, as I see Dana already saying in the live chat. Actually, you need to cut that out because my guest this week is a resident of Canada, which I believe, and Pastor June, you can set me straight on this, but I believe that is the actual frozen north.
Parts of it, yeah, it gets that way. I,
So I want to welcome Pastor June Joplin to the show. Thank you so much for coming on and for being my guest this week. And how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to this, and it's quite, it's very cold here. I have been out on the little river that runs through my neighborhood and skated on it twice in the past week, and I think you could park a truck on it right now. It's
Oh
so
yeah,
frozen solid.
it's ice skate on the river cold.
Yeah, Joni Mitchell. You can maybe wear out
There you
the way
go.
on. Like it's perfect.
There you go. So before we get too far into things, and I have the feeling just from chatting with you a little bit before we went on the air that this will probably be a pretty quick hour because
Yeah.
we seem to get on okay. So, but I want to ask you if you could tell the viewers a little bit about the charities. Actually, you chose two charities that people can support, and also we want to talk about your GoFundMe page as well because
Yeah.
that's really important. So the first one is the Transmission Ministry Collective. What?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Transmission Ministry Collective is an organization that exists to help transgender Christians. It was founded by Austin Hartkey, who wrote this amazing book that came, well, that's kind of illuminated, but Austin wrote this book called Transforming the
Mm.
Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians. It came out in 2018. And since writing that, he's gotten into this effort, and they're primarily online community, and they're dedicated to caring for and helping to do like spiritual care and faith formation, and to develop leadership potential for transgender non-binary Christians. And I was fortunate enough that Austin's book came out just as I was becoming self-accepting, so I can remember like being on the train to some of my first therapy sessions and reading his book. He is a trans man and a Bible scholar, and very, I think, accessibly and expertly kind of makes a case for like Christian acceptance of trans people. And I think that's pretty important because I think first, there are lots of Christian trans people out there, and just about everybody in North America is at least like Christian adjacent. And
Hmm.
so I hear from trans people who are atheists, and they say, well, my mom goes to her Baptist church, and like, how can I talk to her about coming out? And so, um, I think between trans people that are people of faith, and trans people that are faith adjacent, it's pretty helpful. I did pick a second charity though, because
Yes, please.
I don't
Yeah.
know. Folks may not want to donate to an explicitly Christian charity, and I understand that completely. But Egal Canada is the other one, and Egal works for LGBTQ plus rights here in Canada, and their work around promoting inclusivity, especially within youth hockey, ironically, had a lot to do with me becoming self-accepting. So I really admire the work that they do.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I just want to say I would have been and am like perfectly happy to send people to Transmission Ministry Collective, but and
Yeah,
you volunteered a more secular charity as an alternative. I just think that's really cool of you to do that. Even though
yeah. Well,
so if anybody watching for whatever reason has a hang up with donating to a religious charity, a gal is a terrific alternative. Um, and I mean, and if you can afford to donate to both, why
yeah,
not?
right.
And also we also have and those are linked in the description of the video, and also linked is your GoFundMe, because since you were fired from your last job after you came out, you've been sort of between gigs. So
Yeah,
that's important that we let people know about that too.
it has been my primary source of like daily income since
Yeah.
August, roughly, and people have given very generously. And when I was getting close to coming out, I was thinking to myself, what am I doing, June? You're crazy. You're not even going to be able to pay your rent in September, October. And, I've been able to
Yeah.
pay my rent and feed my kids and, keep a roof over their head for the past 6 months, and hopefully I can start working full time soon. But it's not always easy looking for work as a trans woman minister.
No, no, yeah. So we were chatting a little bit before the show, and I guess the first thing I want to ask you is, do you need to get that?
Yeah, I don't know why that's. Oh goodness.
Oh, there we go.
I
You're
don't know
back.
what that was.
I
I
have
don't know
no
who
idea.
that was or how they did that.
I have no idea.
Because my phone's on silent. But anyway.
Anyway, but I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you is what a little bit about sort of your history with your faith, with the church. Did you grow up in the Baptist church? How did you find yourself in that sort of particular, not just Christianity or religious belief in general, but like that particular corner of Christianity?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a small town in Western North Carolina.
Hmm.
Um, pretty close to like where Billy Graham is from. And
Yeah.
pretty much everybody in that part of the world goes to church, almost everybody. At least that probably would have been statistically the case maybe like 30 or 40 years ago, especially. And I think statistically, most of the Christians in that area would be Baptist. There are Baptist churches everywhere. In my home county, there would be maybe like 5 or 10 Baptist churches for every church of another denomination. And so I actually grew up attending a church that was established on land that was adjacent to my grandfather's farm. So my family had been attending that church for generations.
Oh, wow.
I grew up there, and it was a proudly fundamentalist church. I didn't really realize what that meant as a kid. I wasn't, very aware of, I guess, the cultural Christianity and kind of the different theological expressions of Christianity when I was a little kid. But looking back, my mother has an old bulletin from one of the Sundays not long after I was baptized, and there's an article in the bulletin that says, here's what it means to be a fundamentalist, and this is why we are proudly fundamentalists. So that's kind of how I grew up. There absolutely wouldn't have been space for a little kid to come out as a transgender or anything like that. But as I've grown up, as I've gotten older, and tends to call into ministry and gone into ministry,
Mm-hmm.
A lot has changed. Not just my sense of identity, but the way I understand my faith, my personal theological convictions, and I reside now in a different part of the church that is quite different than anything that I grew up around.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the things, because as I was telling you before we started the show, I read the Vox article about you that came out after you were fired by your church, and one of the things that was sort of encouraging to me about it, or a little heartening to me about it, was that there were not obviously there were people in the church who were against you, and that's why you lost your job, but there were a lot of people that were on your side.
Yeah, there sure
And
were.
yeah, and that sort of, I found that very heartening, because the first sort of word association that comes to mind when I hear Baptist is, a very conservative form of Christianity. I sort of default to like the Southern Baptists, and
Yeah,
so the assumption that I make is, oh well, there's, like, you're going to be all by yourself there. Like, if you are a trans person in a Baptist church, you're going to be surrounded. But apparently, even though obviously there was and is a lot of hostility towards you, there's also a lot of love and support around you as well. So yeah, like, what sort of is it just one of those things where it's just a lot more complicated than it looks
it,
to those
it
of us from
really
the
is.
outside?
Um, the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant denomination in North America,
Yeah.
and they are incredibly conservative. They're pretty much the only large Christian denomination in the United States where the fundamentalists within the denomination won when fundamentalists started like debating or fighting and splitting other denominations. So you take, for example, like the Presbyterian denominations in the United States. There are some fundamentalist Presbyterians within Presbyterian life, but when they first started kind of crystallizing around their really, historically unchristian ideas, other Presbyterians said, okay, we don't agree with you. And when all the votes got cast, which is usually how like denominational politics gets done, they were vastly outnumbered. So they went and started their own thing. That kind of thing has happened in a lot of the denominations in the US and in North America, and within Baptist life, the fundamentalists won. And so the larger group of Baptists in the States are the ones that are very far to the right. And there are numerous other Baptist denominations, the American Baptist churches, which they're the result of a split that happened over slavery and during the time of the American Civil War. There's I was involved in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which kind of split off of the Southern Baptist Convention between the 70s and the 90s over issues about how to interpret the Bible and whether or not women could be ministers. And there are tons of other Baptist groups in the States, some more conservative, honestly, than the Southern Baptist Convention, but a lot that are not. The interesting thing about Baptists, and I can talk about this stuff all day, and nobody's going to find it interesting, but I think it's interesting. That
I'm sure a few people watching will find it interesting. Yeah, go for it. Go ahead.
But all of our churches are independent. So Baptist churches can be very liberal. They can be the most liberal churches in your town, but that doesn't mean that the next town over, that Baptist church is going to be very liberal. Canadian Baptists ordained the first Black woman in their denomination in 1919, over 100 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And there weren't other denominations doing that back then, but there was a group of Baptist Christians around the Detroit, Windsor corridor right there. And they said, Jenny Johnson deserves to be ordained. And so they ordained her. Calvary Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. ordained Allison Robinson in 2014, and she's a trans woman. So she was one of the first openly trans women to be ordained in any church in the U.S. Nancy LaDan made the news in the late 70s when she came out and transitioned as a Roman Catholic priest. And later, when she got back into church ministry, it was at Wedgwood Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. So right there, like in Billy Graham headquarters, in one of the, with tons of conservative fundamentalist Christians right there, there was in the 1990s a trans woman serving as a minister at a Baptist church. So those are very rare, but they do exist.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important to point those out, and not I mean, specifically in cases of trans people, because trans folks are so marginalized, but also just I think it's important to tell the story that, because like as I said, and I know a little, I don't know as much about it as you do, because it's not part of my life and it's not, but I know a little bit more about sort of the history of the various, versions of Christianity than maybe a lot of non-Christians do. But even I sort of, I hear Baptist and I automatically think conservative. And I think it's really important to tell the story that, yes, there are a lot of conservatives. There are a lot of very, very like dyed in the wool fundamentalists that worship that follow a form of that faith that would be categorized as Baptist, but that they don't own it. That there are and always have been people with a different interpretation, people who, from my perspective, I would call a little more open-minded, a little gentler in terms of how they perceive outsiders or people who are quote unquote different. And, I think it's really important to put that out there as well.
I think it's especially important now because I think conservative Christianity, evangelical Christianity, which evangelical is really just a synonym for fundamentalist at this point. Evangelical Christians in the United States seem to be the dominant expression of religion. And just based on public perception of Christianity, you would think most Christians probably are, conservative evangelical. Research suggests that that's not true, and that there are a lot more open and affirming Christians. There are a lot more Christians that would be consistently progressive by an
Hmm.
almost 2-to-1 margin than there are conservative Christians. It's just the conservative Christians really kind of punch above their weight. They have a more they have a more coherent narrative,
Yeah.
um, and yeah, there's a new book that I just finished reading, and it's wonderful. It's called Just Faith by
Hmm.
Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons, and Guthrie is a queer Baptist deacon from Louisville, Kentucky, and the book is an outline of both the history of progressive Christianity in the United States, stories about how progressive faith leaders don't always get recognized as faith leaders. Like, he makes the point that they made a list of like the greatest Americans, and there was a category for faith leaders that included folks like Billy Graham and Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah.
But then there was a category for like social activists, and that's where they put the Baptist preacher, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He was a faith leader. When
Yeah.
he marched for civil rights, he was doing preacher stuff. He was doing Christian stuff. It just happened to also be civic advocacy stuff. But the book also looks at the picture now in the hopes to encourage progressive Christians who are in like a 2-to-1 majority to reclaim more of that public discourse.
Yeah. I draw some hope from that,
Yeah,
because
I was
well,
very hopeful in it.
because it reminds me of it lines up with what I have thought for a long time, and with what I think polling and thankfully recent election results throughout the United States have suggested, which is that the same thing is sort of happening with conservatives in politics,
Yeah,
where the amount of political power that conservatives hold in terms of elected offices in state legislatures and in Congress and so forth is not actually representative of the number of people in the
yeah,
overall general population who hold those beliefs, that they are able to maintain more political power than they maybe necessarily deserve based on public mandate because of things like gerrymandering and voter
yeah,
suppression,
yeah,
and they're able to sort of hold on to power that is more than they really ought to have. If the legislatures were more truly representative of the beliefs of the people they represent, they would not be nearly so conservative. And so that, yeah, what you're describing in terms of the, the sort of flavor of religious faith kind of goes along with that. And that, I mean, I find that very encouraging. You
yeah.
know?
It is hopeful.
Yeah.
I hope that like the stories get told the right way. Like the Georgia runoff, for example, I was so excited to see again a Baptist preacher defeat a transphobe in the runoff election
Yes,
in Atlanta, because Raphael Warnock beat Kelly Loeffler, and
that's right.
he's the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, a wonderful, vibrant Baptist community of faith right
Absolutely.
there in Atlanta. And I just every time anybody talks about him, I want to make sure they remember to include the Reverend part in front of his name, because like he is a Christian doing Christian stuff, and that's what Christianity looks like. Now, obviously, not every Christian looks like that, but an awful lot of us do. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I will just say, as an atheist, I wish that more Christians did look that
yeah,
way, that more Christians did view their faith as as a motivator to make the world better, as a
yeah,
motivator to make the lives of other people better, as opposed to turning it inward and using it to sort of be self-justifying, which I think is what happened. I mean, and atheists do that too. We do that with our beliefs, and we shouldn't. I mean, I think it's more difficult, but it's also a lot more rewarding if you can, use whatever your moral compass is, wherever it comes from, if you use that to push you to try and make the world a better place for others, as opposed to just, finding reasons why you're just completely fine the way you are and you don't have to change and you don't, you know what I mean?
yeah.
So, how old were you when you decided that you wanted to become a pastor, because that's a pretty specific career path. I mean, there's
Yeah,
lots of people who are deeply religious who don't decide
yeah.
to go for that job.
I really felt a strong sense of calling into like vocational ministry when I was about 11 years old. Um, I had just aged into the youth group at my church, and I felt, I felt really awkward. I
Hmm.
felt kind of, I don't know, uncool, unlovable, all those things that you feel when you're 11 years old and you're hanging out around older teenagers. And my youth minister often would take time just to hang out with me and talk with me, and just by his presence helped me to see that like I mattered as a human being, that somebody out there cared about me. And it wasn't too long after experiencing that in a couple ways that I said, you know what, I want to do this. Like I want to do this for other people.
Hmm.
And I was like at Jesus camp one summer, sleeping on an island in the middle of a lake in upstate New York. And
Wow.
um, they would have this campfire worship service during the middle of the week, and I guess it was there, probably right around there, that I really started to sense, you know what, June, like this is something that you can do with your life to make a difference. And so by the time I came home from that experience at camp, I was telling people at my church, I feel like I've been called into ministry. And at the time, of course, I was being perceived as a little boy. So I got lots of affirmation, lots of support, and even got a couple opportunities to like preach when I was 11, 12, 13 years old. And just kind of, I dedicated myself in one way or another to following that sense of vocation for as long as it took me to finish university and then seminary. And I got ordained in 2007, about 13, 14 years ago. By the time I was 18 or 19, I was volunteering with youth, and I got my first job in a church doing part-time youth ministry, and I've just kind of been doing it one way or another ever since.
Yeah. Was that all still down in North Carolina when you got started?
Yeah, my first church job was while I was in university in North Carolina,
Yeah.
and then I moved to Richmond, Virginia, to attend seminary, and I was there as a student for 4 years. And then my first church was also in Richmond, so I ended up staying there for about 11 or 12 years altogether.
Wow.
And then I moved here.
You escaped.
Yeah, yeah, sort of. Yeah,
Well, obviously you didn't escape everything, unfortunately, but
yeah.
yeah. That's sort of like, I know I make that joke with friends of mine who are Canadian, and like, oh, you're so lucky you live in Canada, you live in like the land of promise, and we're all stuck down here in the United States. And they're usually in a very loving, good natured way. They like to remind me that it's not always so great up there either.
Um,
That I have like sort of a rose colored picture of, oh, you go up to Canada and all your problems disappear. And it's like, oh, no, 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 no.
yeah.
It's not the way it is.
I, I think one of the best ways to get a clear picture of that is to listen to Black and Indigenous voices.
Oh, yeah.
And goodness gracious, I just finished reading A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott, who is a First Nations writer here in Toronto, and it's a collection of personal essays about her experiences growing up as a First Nations woman, and it paints a picture of Canada that I think more of us white people should probably be listening to. Um,
Yeah.
all that said, some of the political theater that happens in the States doesn't seem to make its way up here, which is why I think Canadians are so fascinated by everything that's happening just south of the border.
Well, I hope everybody up there is having a good show. I mean, hopefully the show will be a little less interesting for the next few years,
Yeah.
at least. Although I'm sure that we'll still have, I mean, as has been shown already, even though Joe Biden is now the president, there's still going to be plenty of kooks and weirdos and
Yeah.
that are going to be taking up time on stage, unfortunately. Um, but so what was, I mean, you uh, you didn't come out publicly until last year.
That's right.
right? But how long was sort of the process of sort of coming to terms with your identity, and what role did your faith, not just your position as pastor of a church, but just generally your faith play in that? Like, were there aspects of, even though I gather that you sort of have been part of a more progressive, more modern, uh, uh, variant of Christianity, of the Baptist faith, were there still elements of it that maybe that you had been brought up with that were sort of at odds with who you were understanding yourself to be now?
Yeah, I would say so. I I became aware of the need for the Baptists in my world to evolve and get better on LGBTQ plus inclusion,
Hmm.
probably around 2003, 2004, my first year of seminary.
Hmm.
Um, there was a code of ethics at the seminary that it was probably a pretty common thing for seminaries, that included a provision about just like your relationship and your sexual activity, that would have excluded any gay or lesbian or bisexual student from really being in keeping with that code of ethics. And it would have also, as it was understood, required faculty to kind of rat them out to administration. Really, really unjust,
Yeah.
and it changed, but at the time it was really not a good thing. Our student life director recognized that and said to the president of the seminary, "Look, this is unconscionable. I am not going to do this. This shouldn't be there." And was subsequently kind of forced to resign. Now,
Wow.
this, and it is a great example of how, like, a cisgender heterosexual white man, just by being a good ally, lost his job.
Yeah.
And I was really hurt. I was really furious because I loved this guy. He was one of my favorite members of the seminary community. And so I went to talk to the president of the seminary and just say, "What the heck, man?" And one of the things I was told is, like, we just can't throw our hat in that ring right now. We've been fighting to we've been fighting for women in ministry for 10, 15, 20 years. And if we go all in on acceptance of LGBTQ plus people, we'll undo all that progress. It's just not time, basically, was the word. It's just
Yeah.
not time. Give it some time. Give it a couple of years and we'll get there. And that was 2003, 2004. And I kept hearing some variation of that argument again and again and again from different leaders in the church, from then right up until I came out. Like, we're just not ready to have this conversation. We're just not
Yeah.
ready to have this conversation. It's going to be too divisive. It's going to be too controversial. And meanwhile, LGBTQ plus people of faith and folks who are adjacent to faith communities are suffering greatly. And in fact, like, one of the things that really made the issue urgent for me was reading about how religion increases the likelihood that queer youth will experience suicidal ideation.
Yeah.
Like, if you're a teenage Christian, chances are connecting to your church is going to make you feel better about life. It's going to make you happier with yourself. It's going to be a source of, inspiration and hope and goodness. If you're LGBTQ plus, it's going to make you want to kill yourself. Statistically, it's
Yeah.
overwhelmingly likely that it will. And the more important religion is to you, the more likely that is. And so we're not just talking about, a theoretical debate. Like, I don't know, do we baptize by putting people under the water? Do we baptize by sprinkling people? Do we sing this hymn or do we sing that hymn? Is this part of the Bible literally true, or is it a metaphor? Like, this is like life and death. And
Yeah.
the church is saying, "No, we're not ready. We're not ready. We're not ready. We're not ready. We're not ready." And I got so sick of it. And every time I tried to make inroads, every time I tried to bring it up as a conversation piece, I always got that from, well-meaning cisgender heterosexual people. We're not ready. So I did what I could to be an advocate, but for most of that time, I wasn't self-accepting. Once I became self-accepting, And as I wasn't really sure like what I was going to do about transition. I wasn't really sure what I was going to do about coming out. But as my path forward became clearer, I realized like I have the potential, if I do this the right way, to force a lot of people to have conversations
Mm-hmm.
that they've done a lot of damage by refusing to have for decades.
Yeah.
So if I do this, they're not going to be able to say, well, we just aren't ready yet. We're not ready yet. Well, you're going to be ready. And you know, that was kind of my thinking.
Yeah. And you know, it does. I think as a cis hetero guy who has never had to contemplate, you know, I've never had to come out as any, even as an atheist. Like that,
Yeah.
you don't really, you don't. I mean, you kind of come out as an atheist, but it's not nearly the same thing. Um, uh, so I mean, there were other ways, I'm sure, that you could have gone about it. You could have, you know,
Yeah.
you could have found another job first, or
Yep.
retreated from public view and then come out. I mean, I think, I don't think ultimately, and you know, I don't think that not coming out was probably an option. Like eventually you were going to
Yeah.
have to
It
be
was going to
openly,
happen.
yeah,
I
you were
mean,
going to have to be
honestly,
who you are.
um, it would have been really weird if I'd have just said, I resign and we can't really talk about it. And then, you know, show up someplace else.
Oh, so that's what that was about.
And yeah, well, and think of the message that would have given about
Yeah,
my trans identity. Like, I'm so ashamed of this and it's so wrong that I just decided to
yeah.
disappear. You know, the way I say it is I refuse to be complicit in my own marginalization.
Hmm.
I very deliberately said, this is who I am. I'm not ashamed that this is who I am.
Yeah.
I'm willing to tell you, I'm willing to look you in the eye and tell you in front of the whole world. And now, guess what? You get to look me in the eye in front of the whole world and tell me what you think about it. Um, and so, you know, it was pretty uncomfortable, but beautifully, marvelously uncomfortable.
Yeah. I mean, it takes some guts to do it the way you did it, and I admire that.
Yeah,
And using something that is obviously, I mean, God, one of the most personal things to any person, you know, and to do it in a way that would force conversation and would hopefully force people to, who maybe weren't okay with it, or weren't
yeah,
supportive of it, to interrogate their own beliefs, or to at least be forced to answer for it in some way. And you know, like
yeah,
if you are not okay with this, why aren't you? And maybe you should think about that, you know, because like I say, you know, you didn't have to do it that way. You could have found a way to do it a little more privately. And I think it's wonderful that you did it the way you did it. And, you know, and obviously, uh, you know, took a little bit of a hit because of it.
yeah. You know, like I mentioned earlier, a couple of trans ministers,
Yeah.
trans clergy, and you know, as a trans clergy person, there's been times that I've felt just like, God, there's nobody like me out there, but it's not true. There are a good many, you know, good grief. One of the folks I've kind of gotten to know since coming out is Reverend Dr. Penny Anderson.
Mhm.
And she's a trans woman and she's the rector of an Anglican church that's even farther out in the Toronto suburbs than I live. Just very, you know, just doing her job
Yeah.
without very much fanfare, honestly. Um, there are lots of us. I talked to Reverend Meg Rohrer, who's the first transgender person ordained in the Lutheran denomination, and they use they them pronouns. And um, they told me there are about 300 of us trans clergy in North
Mhm.
America. So, like, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Um, there are a few stories of folks kind of like me who attempted to like not make this a thing, to not create controversy, to like maybe like self-protection, which is a totally valid thing, who chose to come out a little bit more privately. And that's often a story where some people hear about it and they kind of get erased. Like they lose their job, they never get a chance to tell their people
Yeah.
what's going on, and they're treated as if they never existed. So there's this kind of deplatforming that happens. And knowing that that was the case, I said, I'm not going to let that happen to me. Again, like, I'm not going to be complicit in my own marginalization. This isn't something that warrants me disappearing or sneaking away or anything like that. And so I'm going to do it very openly.
Yeah. Have you heard from other people, either in the church or maybe outside of the church, who learning about you and your story has encouraged them to come out themselves,
Um,
or has helped them in some way? Because I imagine every time one of these stories is told, I imagine there are people out there that hear it
yeah,
and find the courage to do something similar themselves that they've been wanting to do.
yeah. I mean, I get messages. I don't get flooded with them, but
Mm,
from time to time, I get emails or direct messages on social media from folks who say just how grateful they are to know, like, here's a trans woman minister that kind of makes them feel okay about their identity and their faith. Because so many of us are made, because of lies we've been told about God, to feel like those two things are in conflict. And that's, in fact, the way I felt for, I knew that I wanted to be a girl when I was 11 years old. I also knew
yeah.
that, like, I can't tell anybody about this. And there wouldn't have been anybody to say, okay, being transgender is a thing, and here's what happens. Here's what you can do now. So I just repressed, and I don't want that to happen to other people. So yeah, I've heard that from some folks. I've gotten messages from people who said, I left my church because I realized if that my church would do to you what your church did, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and honestly, like, I think that's great. I don't think anybody should go to a non-affirming church. I think every decent human being should walk out of their non-affirming church, like, right now. And it frankly kind of shocks me that people of good faith, people who aren't prejudiced or homophobic or
Mm.
transphobic, still go to churches that espouse, and take their kids to those churches that espouse homophobia and transphobia.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a mystery to me too. Um, I mean, unless you affirm those beliefs yourself. If you
Yeah.
yourself are an anti-trans bigot, then of course you wouldn't have a problem going to an
Oh, yeah.
anti-trans church. But I mean, like, I've asked religious acquaintances of mine in my personal life in the past, who have gone to churches that that disrespect them in far lesser ways than, a trans person or an LGBTQ person, whatever their identity, would be disrespected by an intolerant church. Like, it's not nearly that, but just little things like, a more conservative church that says that women aren't supposed to cut their hair,
Yeah.
below a certain length or something. And I had a friend who attended a church like that, and she had like a shorter haircut, and then she started growing her hair out, and because, well, the church doesn't like women to have short hair. And I said, why would you go to that church?
Yeah.
Like, why would you go? Why would you go? Because she had just started going there relatively. I can't remember if it was she had gotten married and she and her husband started going to the church, or if she switched churches for some other reason. But I wonder, because I mean, I live in a really, really conservative part of the country. Maryland is, in terms of presidential elections, is a blue state, but
Yeah.
the region of it that I live in is as deep red as you can get, and you cannot walk 10 feet without tripping over a really, really conservative Christian church in this area. And I know that there must be some where you can cut your hair any damn length you want and nobody's going to care.
Yeah.
Why would you go to a church that that you know that exercises that level of authority over something as meaningless as that, and then think about, like, how much worse it is if the thing that they have a problem with is something that is a fundamental part of your identity,
Yeah.
that they're telling you, oh, sorry, that's wrong, you know?
Churches have churches are notoriously dishonest about this stuff, frankly, and especially mega churches. A lot of conservative mega churches attract people who would find their theology repugnant simply because they are not transparent with their theology.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love for somebody in the comments to say, actually, there's one out there, but there's not really an LGBTQ plus affirming megachurch anywhere on the continent.
Mm-hmm.
but people go to these mega churches, including a lot of either allies or queer people, because they're not upfront about what they believe and what they support. Um, and I kind of hope in a way that my story helps maybe some churches be more transparent. I think, you know, I live in Canada, you're in the United States, I'm American. So like freedom of religion is kind of
Yeah.
a way of life. And I think what that means is that if your church wants to say, look, we're not okay with this, I think that's repugnant, but like at least be really honest about it,
Yeah.
you know? Um, and that's I think that's just decency. I think that's, in biblical language, that's just like righteousness, maybe. I don't know. And
Yeah.
so there are lots of churches that kind of fail that test. That's justice. I don't know.
Yeah. There was I can't remember the name of it now, but it's one of the mega churches in California that some like celebrities go to. I can't remember the name of it. If I could
Oh,
remember the name of it, I would say it, but
Hillsong? Is that it?
Hillsong,
Yeah.
Hillsong, yes. And I read it because I read it because I think like Chris Pratt goes to it or something.
Yeah. Well, he was. I don't know.
I don't know, maybe, but he but I read an article about it last year or a year or two ago. I can't remember. And yeah, they apparently do something similar where the superficial message is very open and very accepting and very progressive and very modern, and but if you sort of look just beneath the surface at what they're actually saying, it's
Yeah.
really super conservative and traditional, and very at odds with the facade that they're projecting.
Very much.
They're trying to make it seem like, oh, we're just laid back, we're just a chilled out church. We come as you
Have
are.
great music. The
Yeah,
stage value, the production value is perfect. Like
yeah. And then
like
but
going to a
when
rock concert.
and then you actually start paying attention to it, and you're like,
Yeah, like look at the legislation they support,
yeah,
in California or in Australia where they're headquartered. Look at the political movements that their leaders, are behind, and how
yeah,
they aim to strip rights away from LGBTQ plus people, or make life harder for LGBTQ plus people, and all of a sudden, I mean, they're I've heard megachurch pastors give sort of pay kind of like lip service to like, we ought to love gay people and lesbian people, trans people, and they can say that, and they can actually probably be sincere about it. But we love you, but we don't want you to have rights. We love you, but we don't want you to have access to gender affirming care. We love you, but we would rather you not have the right to get married.
hmm
Um,
yeah. Well, it's the
and
same.
so it's
It's the same pattern that they have about women's equality.
yeah.
It's the same sort of condescending, like you're valued, you're loved. We like, but oh, can women serve in the leadership? No, we'd rather
No,
not. So it's yeah,
there's a church here in the Toronto area, biggest church in the area, I think, multiple campuses. And I heard their pastor once say, he was talking about, what would happen if a gay couple wanted to join the church. And the comment he made was, we're a conservative church. We don't believe that's okay, but we want to love people so much that they think we're liberal. And I thought, that is damned insidious.
yeah,
That's evil. It made my skin crawl, but that's how they operate. And that's why, like, I know queer people that go to that church and think it's okay, but I
yeah.
rant about this all day.
Well, yeah. I mean, so could I, just sort of from more of an outsider. I mean, I'm at with you. You're much more informed as an actual person who is a practicing, committed Christian. I look at it as from the outside perspective of someone who doesn't believe. But I mean, like I didn't I was never really in like a very religious family. My sort of people are nominally Methodist, but
Yeah.
like that's my background. But my parents never regularly attended a Methodist church. In fact, the only church we there was a church in the town where I grew up. I grew up in a small town with like a population of like 400 people,
Oh
and
well.
we went to, and I don't think no, there was a Methodist church. We just didn't go to it. I have no idea why, but we went to a church. It was a Church of God for like a few months when I was about 7 years old, and then we stopped going. And that was the only time we ever like regularly attended church as a family.
Yeah.
Um, but I had this sort of voyeuristic fascination with like, the 700 Club and,
Yeah.
TBN and like the sort of charismatic evangelical Christianity, like televangelism. And as I grew up and became more aware of what it was and what the problems were with it, I started to think, like I know Christians in my life, some of whom are very nice, very good people. And it's really too bad that they are represented in popular culture by people like
Yeah.
this. That like the most watched uh Christian television personalities are these hucksters, and not just hucksters, but I mean when they do talk about politics or when they do talk about social issues, they're always, you know, so anti-equality and
Yeah.
so backwards in their thinking and so regressive in so many ways. And it's like, it really, if I were in your position and I were a Christian but was of a more progressive, sort of open-minded, open-hearted perspective, I would feel like as though my version of my faith was almost never seen
Yeah.
in
I mean,
popular culture.
and that's the reality. I mean, that's in part, I mentioned Just Faith, Guthrie Graves Simmons' book, and that's, I wish that was a bestseller. I wish like every Christian in the country and the continent would read it, simply because like it says two things. Like I said, one, this conservative evangelical stuff is an aberration that's out of step with like the whole history of the church, and it's kind of uniquely American, and it's developed within the last 100 years or so. And two, there are more of y'all progressives than there are folks like that. They're just better with branding, you
Yeah.
know. Probably the best example, and I hate to even bring them up because, like, by bringing them up, I prove the point. But like Westboro Baptist Church,
Oh yeah.
it's like 5 people.
Yeah.
There's not
Literally, it's like one
it,
family.
I don't know how many 5-person churches. I mean, it might be 20. I don't know. It's not many. It's one of those. It's incredibly small, mostly one family, like you said. But they're in the news constantly because they're really good at getting attention. And so that just kind of happens over and over and over. And again, I think sometimes more progressive religious figures, inclusive, justice-oriented, interested in reconciliation, equality, stuff like that, their faith doesn't get, or their role as faith leaders doesn't get emphasized in the same way.
Yeah, it's one. Also, I think this is a point that I sort of hit with a lot of different things. It's just the easy story to tell.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the easy story to tell. It's like, oh, it's like it's the caricature. And it's not that it's not representative of a lot of Christians, because I think it is, but it leaves out a whole bunch too.
Yeah, it sure does.
And the people that it leaves out, unfortunately, are, from my perspective, are those who should probably be the ones that are front and center, as opposed to the far right, super conservative, super fundamentalists.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that are going to be dragging those other people into the future, whether they want to come or not, because that's kind of the way it's always been.
It's almost like there's a different way, and I don't know, this might be off base, but this is just kind of what you can observe happening. I can't think of her name. Is it Marjorie something? She's a congresswoman.
Marjorie Taylor Greene. Okay,
like totally against trans rights. And do you know why she says she's against trans rights? Because of the Bible.
Of course.
Like, she tweets constantly. She doesn't know how to read the Bible. She's really bad at it. She wouldn't make it 10 minutes in a seminary course, much less like a respectable Sunday school class. But like, she tweets transphobia and says, basically, if you want the June interpretation, hey everybody, I'm transphobic because of the Bible. And she says that. Now, there are tons of Christian legislators who want trans people to have rights in the United States. Raphael Warnock's a great example.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah McBride, transgender state senator
Yeah.
in Delaware.
Yeah.
Like you read her memoir. There's a lot of faith in there. But you know, if she supports a trans rights, if Reverend Warnock supports trans rights, he's probably not saying trans rights because of the Bible, trans rights because of Christianity. When really, I mean, I support trans rights because I'm a person of faith, but it's not the only reason. But yeah, there's like I said, they're just really the rights, the bigotry that is religiously motivated is they're really good about being on message.
Yeah.
And so yeah, they take up a lot of air.
Well, and they're also really good going back to something that I said a little while ago about, you know, using your people who use their religious beliefs or their beliefs, whatever they are, to justify themselves as opposed to using it as motivation to grow and change and be better and make the world better. And there is a certain sort of self-justifying mindset, you know,
Yeah.
where you can find things in the Bible or whatever your religion had, whatever your sacred text is. I'm sure with the Quran or with the you know the Upanishads, whatever your sacred text is, whatever your religion is, you can find things in there that you can interpret that tell you that you're doing the right thing, you know. And to me it's a lot more interesting to note which parts of the Bible a Christian chooses to center their faith on as
Yeah.
opposed, you know what I mean? Because like
Um,
again, like a lot of atheists sort of look at the Bible as a blanket, just like, oh, it's a terrible thing and it has awful things in it.
yeah.
But you know, it also has like my favorite verse, and I'm sure you probably know the chapter and verse. I never can remember the exact chapter and verse, but I know it's from Matthew, and it's that which you do to the least of these, you do to me
Oh
also.
yeah. That's in
And
Matthew 25.
there you go.
Yeah,
And that
it's
is
beautiful.
it's one of the most beautiful expressions of morality and compassion that I know of.
Yeah,
And you
100%.
know, yeah, and so if a person is a person of faith and they center their faith on ideas like that and not
Yeah,
so much, you know, what is often interpreted as the like the anti-gay stuff in the Old Testament,
yeah,
I have a lot more respect for that because you have found parts of the Bible that call out to you as a good person, as a
yeah,
compassionate person, and have said, you know, like I'm going to follow that. That's going to be my North Star,
yeah.
not this other
Well,
stuff.
you know, it's often the case that Christians say, like, I'm just reading the Bible for what it says, but we
Yeah,
all bring our own like cultural associations. We bring our privilege. We bring like the history of interpretation that our community uses. Like,
yeah,
so nobody just approach, and we're reading interpretations done by translators who make sometimes value judgments about what a word means. I mean, you could Google it, like about the history of the word homosexuality in scripture. Like it didn't exist there before like the 40s or 50s. And
yeah,
translators decided, okay, this word that we really don't know what it means, we're going to say it's homosexuals. And that's how it started being translated. And so, yeah, it's it's a very immature approach to scripture that just says, I just believe what the Bible says word for word. It's just, you can't do it. And you don't do it, even if you
yeah,
think that's what you're doing. I think it was like, I remember I was preaching through Matthew a couple of years ago and got to the Sermon on the Mount, which is just, you know, it's incredible. And I found this quote, and I think it was like Kurt Vonnegut or somebody like that, who said, you know, everybody wants to put the 10 Commandments on the walls of courtrooms, but they never want the Beatitudes.
yeah.
Can you imagine people being like, blessed are the peacemakers in the middle of like an American courtroom? Like nobody would go for that. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor. Like nobody wants that. But I mean, that's right at the center of everything.
Yeah. Well, and that's no matter when you think the Bible was written, I think it's pretty inarguable that that's the revised version. Like the
Yeah.
Beatitudes were
Oh yeah.
written were conceived after the Ten Commandments. So,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, if you believe in divine revelation, maybe God was like, okay, yeah, here's a little bit of a rewrite. Focus on this
Yeah,
stuff,
sure.
you know. And by the way, well, go ahead.
You have to, where you have to be careful there, and I just kind of want to, I may not say it right, but you
No,
kind
go
of have
for
to
it.
be careful, especially when you start talking about like some of the mischaracterizations of like what we call Old Testament versus New Testament, that you're not that you're not that you're giving proper credit to our Jewish siblings
Hmm.
who aren't necessarily religious conservatives and who read texts and
Hmm.
handle texts that religious conservatives use as weapons. So it's not always the case that just because a text says this, that the people handling it or reading it are going to be bigots, or even that the stuff that came after it is automatically better. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's
Well, and I wanted to say to everybody watching us live, who is with us in the live chat, if you have questions for Pastor June, go ahead and toss them up, and we'll answer some questions for the last couple of minutes of the show. But yeah, you just reminded me about speaking specifically about Jewish scripture that was incorporated into Christian scripture.
yeah.
Because I used to do a series on my channel where I read and responded to Christian apologetics,
Oh
and
yeah.
almost all of it was very, very conservative. Like there's not a lot of progressive sort of Christian apology, at least not that has been published and that is widely available.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the things I discovered was that I can't, and again, it's been a few years and a lot of it has sort of gone out of my head, but there's an Old Testament, a verse in the Old Testament that is a prophecy that a lot of conservative Christians interpret as a messianic prophecy,
Yeah.
that is interpreted by Jewish scholars I mean, completely uncontroversially. It's almost universally
Yeah.
regarded as referring to Israel, not
Yeah.
referring to
Something different.
Christ. Yeah, and it's like, and from as I and again, as you said a few minutes ago, I mean, you're reading translations of
Yeah.
interpretation, so you can never have a total confidence in that you are interpreting it correctly or that you are understanding what the original author intended. But to me, the interpretation of this is referring to Israel, is the most obvious interpretation,
Yeah.
because I think it even it's not quite this obvious, but it's like the next verse after the section that is usually quoted by the evangelicals, it almost exactly says, and by the way, we're talking about Israel. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not
Um,
ambiguous at all.
the,
Um,
the language for that, I mean, there's kind of there's a word for that approach to scripture and theology, and it's supersessionist. And I know that, and I'm kind of watching out for that
yeah,
because of my friend Jonathan Redding, who's a Reverend Dr. Jonathan Redding, who teaches
yeah,
Old Testament at Nebraska Wesleyan, and I used to be his youth minister. But supersessionist just basically means it's Christian theology that basically says that a Jewish person is just a Christian that hasn't figured things out yet.
yeah,
That we are the more highly evolved, better theological, and like we have complete revelation, and it's garbage, and
yeah.
a
Nothing
lot a lot of
problematic
a lot of
about that.
Christianity falls into that.
Yeah,
And and sometimes it's easy to get there, like I said, like kind of almost where we were a couple of minutes ago when you say, well, the Old Testament says that queer
right.
people
Yeah,
are an
that's yeah,
abomination, but the New Testament like says love, and like, well, that's kind of an oversimplification that
yeah.
doesn't take the full force of Scripture into account.
Yeah. From the live chat, Wim VDB asked, you mentioned the lies I was told about God.
Yeah,
Not believing in a God, I think it's all made up anyway, but how did you determine what were lies and what were not?
yeah. Well, I mean, there are a couple different ways that people of faith generally do that. Among within Baptist life, I guess there are a couple of different. There's one writer that talks about like pillars of meaning or something like that, and
Hmm.
you have kind of a combination of like how you're reading and interpreting Scripture, your personal experience, the experience of your community, um, and then like kind of what does the church say about it? So you've got church, scripture, conscience, and community, I guess, something like that. I might not have gotten that right. And yeah, I mean, it's imprecise. I think the best, most faithful people of faith, Christians, are will tell you, you know, theology is theoretical. We don't know this stuff for sure, but this is how I kind of sort through life for meaning. And generally, like, you know, whatever makes human betterment flourish, whatever makes human freedom flourish. There's the, you know, a Hebrew concept of shalom, which some people translate as peace, but like I've heard translated as comprehensive flourishing. Mm-hmm. What's going to bring shalom? Like what's going to bring comprehensive flourishing to a person, to their life? And that's kind of what, you know, you can sort through scripture and sort through your religious experience and your faith and say, where does the comprehensive flourishing come in?
Yeah. Yeah. Question from Emily Chambers, who says, how do you interpret disability representation and disabled people in your ministry?
Oh, that's a great question. I am a able-bodied person and don't, you know, I don't want to presume to speak for folks that, or I don't want to speak out of my, from outside my own set of privileges. Mm-hmm. I know that there's often debate among disabled people of faith as to like what their disabilities represent and whether there's any kind of like divine intention. I know that churches often need to do better on things like accessibility, not just like with their physical spaces, but incorporating disabled people into the community. And that's certainly a growing edge that I confess I don't know enough about, but that's something I'll want to think about.
Yeah. And I am not being a disabled person myself either. I don't want to, you know, speak for disabled people either, but I get I've talked to, you know, knowing from talking with other people about issues like this. And, you know, I get the impression that some people with disability might find it, might find certain Christian teachings about people with disabilities a little condescending, like the same thing, like the same, and it's similar to when the way some churches teach about, you know, if you have like a serious illness or something like that, and basically anything that is a challenge or that makes your life more difficult is a test or is meant to grow your character. And it's like, well, gee, thanks.
There's a story in the Gospels, in John's Gospel actually, where Jesus meets a person who's been blind from birth, and his disciples automatically assume, you know, Jesus, who sinned? You know, who's the evil person here that caused this person to be blind? Is it his fault or is it his parents' fault? And Jesus kind of says, no, that has nothing to do with what's going on here. And so, yeah, I think there are faith communities and people of faith who probably ought to take that to heart a little better, because there's a kind of condescension or lack of dignity afforded to people.
Yeah. We've come to the end of the hour. Actually, we're a little bit over the hour, which is great because I mean, I could keep talking to you all night about this stuff. But do you want to let people know where they can find you online and where they can go to find out more about you?
I have two Twitter accounts. At J.R. Joplin and at beloved_June. And J.R. Joplin is a little bit more professional and Beloved June's a little more personal, but they're both me. My YouTube channel is Pastor June. It's not a very polished channel. I've started like looking at some of y'all YouTubers and realizing I need to up my game a bit. Mostly it's just me posting recordings of sermons that I'm asked to preach for other congregations so that they can be watched. You know, there's more accessibility there. And then pastorjune.com is my personal website that links to sermons and social media and has my calendar on it. I still do a fair amount of guest preaching, and I enjoy doing that because it's often the case there's never been a trans woman in the pulpit in the places that I go,
Yeah.
even virtually, to preach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One last question that just came in from the live chat. This is from Lisa Garrison, who says, "I'm curious about Reverend Joplin's view on God. Does she follow something like Spinoza's pantheism, or does she
Oh,
believe
goodness.
in a literal sky father?"
I don't believe in a literal sky father.
Sky father, that's like our condescending
Yeah,
atheist.
no.
You
As a
believe
matter of
in the sky, the magic sky daddy.
yeah, so this is the one time, surprisingly, the one time I ever really got trolled on Twitter was when
Yeah.
I was posting about this. There's a day on the Christian calendar in November usually. It's called Christ the King. Originally, it was called Christ the King Sunday. Some churches have taken the patriarchal language out of it, and sometimes they just call it like the Reign of Christ Sunday.
Mm.
And the point I made when I preached a sermon for that Sunday is that the early Christians didn't revolutionize their part of the world by saying like our sky daddy is bigger than your sky daddy. That wasn't it. That's kind of never, shouldn't have ever become the Christian confession.
Mm.
It was rather this brown peasant from Palestine, a place that kind of doesn't matter to the people in Rome, who was executed for treason. That's what God looks like. We see the divine and something that links us all in that. And so I don't know, maybe that's more like the pantheism of Spinoza, who I confess I haven't read
Yeah.
as much as I should. But yeah, at the heart of Christianity historically is this confession that God, the divine, the creator, the love that calls things into being, like, is really close to us. In fact, it's within us, and it's somehow present in this person that is totally unlike what you would assume God would look like. This person that nobody would have cared about. This person that died as a criminal and should have disappeared from human history.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's
it's
nice.
really supposed to be really subversive, and we turned it into like kind of a country club, which sucks. But
we ruined it like we ruin everything. And
that's why you can't have nice things.
this is why we can't have nice things. And on that note, thank you, Pastor June. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's been a real
This was
delight to
great.
be with you.
Yeah, this was so much fun, and I was very glad to have you. And you're welcome back anytime. I would love to have you back on in a few months and talk about stuff some more.
Sure.
It was great, and best of luck to you with everything. And once again, for people who want to donate, the address for Transmission Ministry Collective is on your screen, and also the links to that and to Egal and also to Pastor June's GoFundMe are in the description of the video. I would highly encourage you to support any or all of them if possible. Pastor June, thank you once again.
Thank you
And
so much. Take care.
absolutely. Thanks everybody so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Have a good night, everybody.